Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. Boom. We're off to the races. Dewey, what's up, man? How are you?
What's up, Dave? I'm good, man.
Doing well. Early morning.
Yeah, it's not that early for me. I
Yeah.
don't think it's early for either of us, though.
No, you already woke up and coached, right? You're already at the gym.
Oh yeah, yeah. I went to coach, came back, and then I'm gonna go back.
I like
It's
it.
it's the usual.
Well, I think this is going to be a super helpful episode for so many people. And just to frame this up, because I could give Dewey an intro and he would humbly say not half the things he's good at. But Dewey is our head of strength and conditioning at Champion, which is the facility that I treat patients at, that you work at, that we all kind of do we call that like our lab or our petri dish, right? That's where we actually test. And I think people forget that we actually work with humans, like we actually help treat athletes and do stuff every day, not just talk on podcasts. But we've been working together the last 5 years, I think, right? Is that how long it's been?
A little over 4.5. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're approaching 5 years, man. It's
Coming up
crazy.
on it. It's our anniversary. Do you want to have dinner or something like that? Or
Yeah, I think we should go out on a date.
Catherine
Can't
might
tell
be
Catherine, no.
jealous. Don't tell Catherine. So yeah, we've kind of gone the gamut, and you've been someone who's seen literally from the very beginning of Champion forming from just a baseball facility to more of everything, but also like a huge gymnastics population has grown in the last 5 years as I've done more and as we've gotten more people on the medical side. But something I'm super proud of is that we're kind of tip of the spear on sports performance for gymnastics and really kind of pushing the cultural myths and the misunderstandings around everything, right? Gymnasts lifting weights. We have kids that are taking relative off seasons and giving up 2 days of practice time to work out with us and you specifically. And I think that you're really a great benefit because I've learned so much from non-gymnastics people in terms of what has helped in the actual training gym. But I think you and me and other people that we've had in our staff have helped kind of build a path forward for the sport when I think a lot of people are desperately searching for answers on like, what do I do or how do I change, or they understand that they need to learn something new. And we're kind of able to help kind of bridge that gap from, not only old school methodology, but also using really sound principles from other sports or from science. And so I want to make sure that people know that this is a conversation that's not based in theory. It's based really in like, these are things that are results and these are things that we know work. And I mean, you program for all of our Division I collegiate female athletes that come home in the summer, but then also you're working with some of the guys that are on the junior national team and a lot of younger athletes too that are in JOs and are trying to get college scholarships, or even some kids that are chasing like elite national teams. So I think it's cool to talk about the science and the geeky stuff, but also people need to realize like we actually work with these people every single week that are high level gymnasts. So that's where I think the conversation can start from. But do you want to share anything else about your background or things that you think are important before we kind of dig into the weeds here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we can dive right in, but I just want to kind of say that like I'm super fortunate to work with some of who I think are the best physical therapists and strength coaches in the world. Right. And I've gotten to learn so much from Dave and, some of our other mentors as Champion. And it's all this like big old melting pot. So we not only get a bunch of different sports from like a performance aspect, we also get a lot of people on the rehab to performance spectrum from like early post-op all the way to like, higher end return to sport protocols. And then obviously like the full on, like, hey, you were never injured. Let's just make you a complete savage and get you better at your sport. So right. I think we do have a pretty good perspective on sports in general. And then obviously with Dave's background in gymnastics, I've definitely gotten to see that way more. And it's been a ton of fun. I'll say like, I think like programming for my gymnast, and I say this to some of my gymnasts every single time I write them a new program, I'm like, dude, I had fun writing that program.
Yeah.
Because it's just so different.
Yeah.
It's just so different than programming for like a baseball player or like a basketball player. So it's fun on my part. So yep. It's all pretty good in my end.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Yeah. And it's cool because, now we're kind of like random tangents here, but I think we're seeing the culture. I mean, let's be honest, 5 years ago, you and me, and when Kiefer was here and some other people, we were kind of doing this a little bit already, right? We were trying to have summer sports performance programs where gymnasts would come once per week and they would work out with you. They would do maintenance care with me and the other PT people. And like, I think we were dancing around this topic and I don't think people were ready to change. I don't think people were ready to really understand or kind of invest time into it. But fortunately and unfortunately, the last couple of years of controversy and cultural uproar has caused people more than ever to be like, I finally realized maybe there's not only is there another way, but it might be a much more optimal way to help these athletes longevity wise and performance wise by sprinkling in a little bit of strength conditioning or sprinkling in a little bit of like, non-gymnastics work in the weight room. And I think now more than ever, people are finally maybe opening their eyes to be like, wow, that's something that can be really beneficial. And we have a great feedback loop of all the athletes we work with, especially the college athletes, right? We have like 5 to 6 collegiate, like I said, Division I female gymnasts that come home and work out with us, a whole bunch of other D2, D3 that say like, no, I actually feel the best I've ever felt my junior year. In a summer where I did 3 days of gymnastics and 2 days of the strength room versus 5 days in a row of gymnastics. And it's like pretty wild for me to hear from, some of our higher level athletes that have gone through a gauntlet of their career. Usually they feel like garbage their junior, senior year with injuries and burnout and overuse, but like, no, I actually feel the best I've felt. And it's really cool because we're not giving people 4 or 5 days of strength and conditioning. We're giving them a very small dose of what people would think about like 1 rep max front squats and like bodybuilding. That's not at all what we're doing. And I think it's cool for us to be able to break that mold,
Yeah, for sure. And I think you kind of nailed it. I think the biggest thing is the feedback that we get. And it is from the kids that have now been in our strength conditioning program for, 1, 2+ years. Yeah. And they start really noticing like, oh, snap, like I feel better. I feel like I'm hurting less frequently. I feel like I'm performing a little bit better. But like the biggest thing is like they just feel like they can continue to put out work for a little bit longer with a little bit less pain, feel a little bit better, enjoy their sport a little bit more. And that's like the stuff that really makes me want to just continue doing what I do. So
yeah, I love that part too. I love the long-term partnership that we definitely build with some of our athletes, and we kind of go away from that only just like tell me what to do and work out, but we become more like consultants about like, okay, I have this goal in 4 years to get to a college scholarship, or I have this goal of, for some kids, it's like senior national team and possibly in the Olympic mix. And it's like, what do you think I should do in the next 4 years? And the coolest thing too is a lot of their coaches are starting to become on board. Like we have some of the coaches that come work out too, which is awesome. You know what I mean? It's really cool to see that again, that mindset shift away from like reflexively saying this is a waste of time and this is going to actually reduce my performance, to us being able to really build a relationship and teach them about what we can do.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot to do with shifts, man. I think that's like you leading the way, and, guys like Nick Rudock, your friend.
Yep.
I think all you guys are just kind of really paving the way for gymnastics, wanting to get a little bit more information, wanting to get a little bit more involved in strength and conditioning and, increasing performance, decreasing rates of injury. So, I mean, that's hats off to you.
Oh, well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. It takes a village, that's for sure. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Mike and Lenny, and I learned so much from you and Dan and everybody else. So it's really an unfair melting pot that I have to share with people. So, so that being said, I mean, let's really tackle what I think. You have many areas of expertise, but I think one of the things that I've learned the most from you about, and also that I think the athletes, the gymnastics side athletes, have gained the most from it, is kind of like the ability to get that next gear or that top level of explosive power and speed, right? I think a lot of, from the user end of gymnastics coaches, I hear the end result of like, my kids aren't fast enough on vault. My kids aren't like powerful enough on floor. They can't run fast enough. Their running looks like, something out of a very slow motion comedy movie, right? It's very, very hard for them to run properly and sprint properly. And we know there's kind of 2 main elements of sprinting where it becomes most important. One is, which is on floor, which is you have maybe 3 to 5 steps to get a top acceleration and peak velocity if you're doing a max effort tumbling pass. And then we have more of the vaulting side, which is typically about 70 feet worth of max acceleration. So I think I'd like to split this conversation into 2 things. One is the first half, maybe talk about sprinting and talk about speed, velocity in terms of like horizontal displacement. But then also, I think this conversation naturally progresses into the jumping and landing conversation, which is on the performance side, obviously like being able to jump well gives you more height for more skills, but then also the landing side is more the injury prevention and performance side of you for landings and deductions. But I think I'd like to kind of maybe start with sprinting and then talk about the principles and give really concrete ways of how to help people with that, but then morph that conversation into like force absorption and talk about maybe some jumping and landing stuff before we wrap up. Does that sound cool?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, and you absolutely crushed a webinar for our Inner Circle, the Hero Lab, on kind of like really walking people through kind of your philosophy. But I'd like to maybe start with just outlining, maybe let's just talk generally about what goes into power, because I think power is going to be a really important variant here in speed and landing. So let's just talk about what goes into power first, and then from power we can talk about sprinting, actual nuts and bolts.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so when it boils down to it, as far as like how I think, I'm kind of a nerd with some of this stuff. So I like going back into like the basics, physics one, right? So how do we define power? So power is force times velocity, right? How much force can an athlete produce, and how quickly can that athlete produce that force? So the way that we kind of think about our training is literally breaking up power into those two segments. So when it comes to an athlete that wants to be faster on floor or for vault, I say, all right, what are my components? How do I make you better at producing force? And how do I make you produce force faster? So the way that I program is I pick the drills that improve force production, and then I pick drills that improve velocity. And then kind of on like the back end of it is, one of the cool things that we really preach a champion is assessing and really understanding what an athlete comes to us with. Is we assess to make sure, all right, are you a little bit more deficient on the force end of things, or are you a little bit more deficient on the velocity end of things? And what we can do is we can simply say, all right, you're a little bit better at force right now, so let's give you a little bit more velocity currently. Or if it's vice versa, right, we give you a little bit more velocity because you're already strong like an ox, right? And let's try to fill in the gaps to kind of make you a better overall powerful athlete. So that's all it really is when it comes to like the definition of power on my end.
Yeah. And right there, I want to definitely kind of dig into that one more layer is, so say somebody is trying to think about whether there's a strength coach listening to this or a gymnastics coach or a medical provider, how would they determine this person needs more of the strength bucket versus this person needs more of the velocity bucket, maybe with like one or two things?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're definitely fortunate to have a little bit more like technology available to us. So it's a little easier on our end. We use a jump mat that kind of shows how high someone can jump for like a regular vertical jump. And then we also do what's called the elasticity test on that same mat, where we have an athlete go 4 jumps in a row. That kind of shows us how quickly they can rebound in and out of a jump while still trying to get up really high, right? So in that scenario, and I can give you guys a little bit more information on how to test or maybe see where the athlete fits without the technology. But if you have access to a jump mat, what you do is you take a vertical jump, you see what their max vertical jump height is. If they're through the roof compared to the norms according to their age group and their gender, but then they do the 4 jump test, and the norms for that say that, all right, when it comes to repeated jumps, you're not as good at producing that max height again. When you add in that velocity, when you add in that quicker load time, then we know that you're probably a better athlete at producing force. Whereas the other way could be if we do that 4 jump test and your average jump height for the 4 jumps is almost the same as your max vertical jump height, right? That probably tells us that you're missing the force component of things.
Right.
So that's the way that we test in our assessment protocol. And now I get that not everyone's going to have access to that. We didn't really either until 6, 7, 8 months ago. And that's where your coach's eye really has to come into play. So the way that I would kind of describe it is, let's say we're talking about jumping, sprinting, whatever it may be. You got to take a look at how quickly an athlete can like rebound in and out of passes, rebound in and out of a jump. If they visibly to your eye look like they're just like bunny rabbit bouncy every single time they jump repeatedly, they have very minimal knee bend, but they can get up super, super high, right? I call that bouncy elastic, right? So they're probably a little bit better on the velocity end of things. They don't need a ton of like a load to explode and able to produce power. But then you're going to see an athlete that's, usually pretty like sticky on the floor. They're a little bit slower getting in and out of passes or getting in and out of a jump. Those are people that are probably a little bit more towards the force end of things.
Got it.
So that's where you do need to develop a little bit of a coach's eye. But I think it is pretty evident. Like every time I see our athletes do like reply variations in the gym, right? Even if I hadn't done that assessment on the jump mat, I can typically tell like, all right, if you can get up onto like a really high box, but then I put you on hurdles and we have 8 hurdles in a row and you have trouble being quick on those 8 hurdles, then I know that you probably lack a little bit of the velocity end of things. You lack a little bit of that elasticity.
Yep. No, that's super well said. And I guess the non-technology variant of that too, you also could just do like, squat jumps and counter movement jumps and then do drop depth landings, right? So you have someone do a squat jump and jump as high as they can. And again, you're using like back of the envelope, your eye, right, as the test, not so much as it. But if you have an athlete who can sit and do one seated squat jump and can jump through the roof, but then they do a depth jump and they try to react off the floor, especially a spring floor, and it looks like really slow, they're on the floor for a long time, they don't go as high, that's a force absorption and kind of like you said, velocity technical kind of point of view versus when that athlete jumps by itself, you know they have muscular capacity to get really far off the ground. It's in the tank. It's just a matter of them being able to kind of use that. And then again, if you do 4 squat jumps in a row and they look slow as molasses, like again, you're probably putting someone more in the you're strong enough bucket. We just need to get you train either the speed of velocity or teach you technically how to bound well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. And then the one thing to add to that is, you know, you do got to keep in mind that like an age group and athlete is probably going to dictate some of this also.
Sure.
And what we find is that for like our really young athletes, let's say like 13 and younger, those people like 9 out of 10 times, they're going to be missing force, right? Simply because they're younger, they don't have enough muscle mass, force production capability. They don't have the muscular contractions. Like those people, 9 out of 10, I would say almost 10 out of 10, but I don't want to like miss on any.
that one freak of nature.
Yeah. But the younger kids, for the most part, will just benefit a ton from just really good strength training.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way to frame this conversation. And this, I was going to say this towards the end of the conversation, but I think it's an important kind of on the principle side is as we talk about gymnastics, there's a very big difference between sport specific, like bounding and sprinting and leaping and stuff like that, and general sprinting, jumping, and landing, right? Because gymnastics does have, so say you're thinking about like, you know, sprinting top end and doing a double back and landing, right? Like there's definitely the general sprinting side. There's the technical ability to do a tumbling pass, and then there's the general landing, right? But then also you have, you know, and this is more on the gymnastics geek side, is like bounding, right? Like front layout, or 1.5 punch lay, or like punch connections are more about technical gymnastic stiffness, right? So when we say like bounding or stiffness in the general side, we're not talking about like pogo jumps with super locked knees on spring floors that you might see in a gymnastics floor routine. Or hitting the springboard for vault, right? We're talking about the general ability to just express force fast and kind of do these things in a strength profile. So we'll talk at the end with landing about maybe the difference between like gymnastics bounding and general athleticism. But I just want to really highlight from the beginning for those that might be confused is that we might talk about the general aspect of speed and agility and jumping and landing. And we're not thinking about hitting the springboard really stiff or hitting the floor really stiff. Those are technical skills you develop with velocity-based training down the road.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely got to be able to separate the two. And, you know, it's the general that gives you the potential for greater specific.
Yep.
Is how I like to think about it. So definitely a good point there, Dave.
Yeah. And kind of just wrapping this little section up before we talk about sprinting is obviously, so we have power, right, is force times velocity. So naturally the way we're going to increase power, as you said, is we have to increase the force or we have to increase the amount of velocity we can express to show that force. And so I think this is like the biggest eye-opening example for many people when I consult with them is like, okay, well, how do you increase force? There's 2 ways you can increase force. You can increase force through strength conditioning, which is just traditional getting large, strong muscle fibers to work and express more force. And how do you do that? I mean, weightlifting is one of the most tried and true ways to get stronger, right? And I think this is always like a little bit of a facepalm moment when it's like, think about how much strength potential we have been leaving on the table for gymnasts because we're so scared of weightlifting or we're scared of doing that. We know, and again, if you're not in the geeky side, black out for like 2 seconds, right? Type 2 fibers that are those fast twitch, explosive, larger muscle units, we can tap into those with good strength training and good progressive overload in weightlifting. And so when you look at athletes and you just peg them as like, well, they're not a fast athlete, right? Or they're not strong enough or whatever it is. Who are we doing the disservice to the athlete by not embracing weightlifting? Because science tells us that especially like type 2B fibers, type 2X fibers are going to get that massive, explosive, fast twitch, large motor units. That's what comes through progressive overload and why strength training is such a staple in every other sport. And so if you have an athlete who maybe isn't genetically born with a lot of fast twitch fibers, they're more of that aesthetic sport athlete for gymnastics, that is a trainable quality still. So proper weightlifting combined with proper technique, which is another way to increase strength, right, is just understanding how to create tension and how to create max expression of force. That is how you increase force. There's no other way to increase force besides literally getting stronger with a combination of weightlifting and gymnastics specific strength or optimizing your technique. And so I think sometimes, unfortunately, people are just like diving right into the power, the sprinting drills, the speed work, the ladders, like the box jumps, and they don't realize like if you don't actually increase someone's foundation of strength, you're pretty much throwing stuff against the wall and hoping it sticks. And so I'd love to hear maybe your thoughts on that first, because that conversation is more important, I think, than the technical aspects of sprinting drills and jumping drills.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think here's the big thing, right? So I think if you do just jump right into like a bunch of jumping drills and bounding and sprinting and stuff, you will probably get better. right? But
Yep.
there is going to be a earlier cap to it.
Yep.
So essentially what we're doing with our weightlifting, our strength training in the gym is we're increasing potential for power, right? So the way that there's a couple different layers to it, right? So when it comes to, power being our like end goal, the other end of it is actually going to start with hypertrophy,
Yep.
right? So getting bigger muscle fibers gives us the potential to produce a little bit more force,
Yep.
right? Having more force gives us the potential to create a little bit more velocity. Having the combination of force and velocity gives us power, right? And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So a lot of people think like, all right, if I want to increase power, I just do power drills. Well, great, you can, right? But that's only going to display the amount of power that you can currently output with your current foundation of hypertrophy and your muscle's ability to contract to produce force. And I think that's important to keep in mind, right? There is definitely a way to improve power by just doing power drills. You're just going to have a much earlier cap. But if we can spend a little bit more time building the foundation, building potential, then there's not going to be this cap of power. You can continue to produce more and more power because you've done the due diligence and improved force and started to improve hypertrophy. And I know like in the gymnastics community, getting bigger is not necessarily like always the end goal, but I do think there's like an optimal body weight that someone can be at. They can look jacked, they can look muscular, maybe weigh a little bit more. I know that's like a poo-poo topic to talk about, but like I've definitely had, especially the male gymnasts, say like, I've put on like 7-8 pounds at this point of muscle, but I feel better than ever. I feel faster than ever. I feel more explosive than ever. So why really be afraid of putting on a little bit of mass,
Yeah, I'm so happy you said that too, because that's definitely I can hear like the keyboards typing already in the email responses that I'm going to get. But I think there's a couple really important things here to pull away, not just for sprinting and jumping and landing, but definitely around this topic. One is that a lot of you can put on slightly more muscle mass and still have a better body composition, right? And we'll talk about Ian later in the podcast maybe, but Ian's a perfect example, as you're talking about, is like he's put on those small amounts of poundage, but his body comp is actually better, right? He actually he feels more light and more lean. And I'm not going to go into the female side, but I've told that from tons of the girls that come to our facility, that weightlifting and adding like 1 to 2 days of extra like loading per week, they're like, yeah, I might be a little bit bigger than I usually are, like heavier, but it's lean muscle bulk. It's explosive fiber type. This is not just like I put on 10 pounds and it's 10 pounds. It's very lean muscle mass that has a functionality, and their body comp is better than it ever was, because we know that they might work with a nutritionist or someone and they say like, no, I feel better, I perform better, I'm slightly heavier on the scale, but because I've worked on these things and I work with a nutritionist and I understand the programming is specific to my sport, I actually feel the best I've ever felt, and I actually, not that it matters, but for them is I look the best I've ever looked, and I feel like I'm longevity wise lasting longer in practice. So like one thing is like, just because numbers are numbers doesn't mean it's non-functional numbers, right? But also too is this is why it's so important to work with a good strength and conditioning coach, because we know the type of exercises you program, the volume, the sets, the reps, the intensity, all that kind of stuff, and the periodization of a plan over 6 months, for example, or sorry, like 3 months of an off season when we have these athletes, based on the programming, you're going to funnel somebody towards the body weight explosive power that we want, and maybe not into like the straight up large muscle bulk like a power lifter might get, or an Olympic weightlifter might get, or even like, like some of our baseball pitchers just need more mass to throw the ball harder, right? And so they're trying to put on mass. We understand the variables that lead to that large amount of, maybe body mass gain, or the very specific lean body explosive power that we're trying to get at. So I know anything more on that, because then I want to talk a little bit about like programming and like blocks before we dive into sprinting mechanics.
Yeah, just the only thing to like clarify a little bit is I think if you do simply just lift weights and you do 3 sets of 10, 4 sets of 8, just like your typical bodybuilding style stuff, and you do get a little bit better or bigger, it might be of hindrance, right? But we're not saying just go out there and lift weights. We're saying have a foundation of weight training, have a foundation of a little bit more muscle mass, but also learn how to express that in a general athleticism sense by doing jumping, bounding, sprinting, maybe even some throwing, and then learning to lift weights fast also.
Yep.
So I think there's definitely that end of stuff that we can't forget. Like simply going to Planet Fitness and banging out like 4 sets of 15 on a machine is not going to get you to be a better gymnast.
Yeah.
I think that's like the key thing to remember.
Yeah.
So saying weight training is important, but weight training done the right way
Yeah.
is what's actually important.
Yeah, and you led the perfect, point I want to make before we actually get into sprinting stuff is like this is all about the proper use of weightlifting, again, by the exercise and the type of work we're doing, but then also as one piece of a building block to a larger plan. So, and practically when people are thinking about like, okay, I conceptually get this, but how would I actually do this, right? So you have to think about, I mean, when we're filming this, not that we want timestamp, but we're in the middle of a season, right? We are not having our athletes do their max hypertrophy work right now because it's pointless, right? It's like they have bigger fish to fry. They're competing. But when we get our athletes back in May, right, we might do a 6 to 8 week block where we're really focusing on like, all right, give you a couple weeks to kind of get the aches and pains down, and they might hang out with me for a couple weeks. But then when they go into the weight room and they start lifting more, that's kind of our main avenue to try to actually get some of this progression, right? But we're not only doing weightlifting stuff, right? They work all athletic qualities when they're in the gym. So they're still working on some bounding. They're still working core work. They're still working light med ball work, right? It's not like we ignore all of the other qualities of athleticism. We're just focusing and biasing one quality of hypertrophy or max strength, right? That's going to be our like periodization bucket we're focusing on. But very quickly, and we've started to do this more even towards the end of the summer, is we're trying to lead them all the way through the funnel of taking those max strength gains maybe in May and June, and by August or early September when they're about to go back to school, is we're actually focusing more on switching to the velocity program, the bounding, getting their Achilles ready to handle some of the impact force and stuff like that. So it's about doing a block of maybe a bias of hypertrophy or strength while you still train a lot of other stuff, and then another block of a bias maybe of velocity-based training, right? And then also okay, now let's put you in a technical refinement setting for gymnastics, and then from 6 months of the year, a lot of it is maintenance care on our side, and it's really like performance aspects. So we're not doing a ton of extra stuff. And I think Scott Wilgris, who's been on here, is he has more timelines to work with because, Ellie and some of the elites that he worked with have like, an entire year. They can work on just the strength hypertrophy for 3 months and then focus on velocity. But it's about a building block based on your time and season. It's not about just throwing weightlifting at the athletes all year long. Again, this is why it's so important to have a really good rationale for periodization and why you're choosing certain exercises and why you need to work with a great strength coach who says like, okay, if you're going to start competing in January, we have 6 months to work with here. Let's chop this up into a 2-month block, a 2-month block, a 2-month block to get you optimally ready for your competitions. And so I think it's just a really important thing to think about is we're not saying that people should be lifting heavy all year long and ignoring gymnastic stuff.
Yeah, I think you can mic drop on the periodization concept right there. I think you just nailed that, blew it out of the water.
Yeah, solid, good. All right, well, we've bantered long enough, and people are finally wanting to learn about sprinting. So let's maybe go with. I think you have a model of kind of like 3 Ps that you were kind of promoting in the webinar that was really good. So let's talk about those 3 Ps, and then we'll dive into the actual nuances of those.
Yeah, so the 3 things that I really prioritize is going to be positions and posture when it comes to sprinting. There's going to be 2 different, phases of this, one being acceleration, the other one being hitting top end speed and maintaining that. The other aspect is going to be power or plyometrics. And then the third is simply just going to be practice, right? And I think all 3 of these are super important. They might be just like evenly important, right? It might be like a 33% split between the 3. And I think that's our best bet as far as improving sprint performance in any sport, but like really for gymnastics. So kind of starting in that first P, right, the positions in practice, there's definitely some distinct things that we see when we see a sprinter, whether it's on, the track and field, or if we're talking about, for vault or floor events in gymnastics, is we see a phase of acceleration where their body's trying to pick up speed. And then we see a phase where they've hit whatever top speed that they need for that particular output event. And they maintain that speed before they go into their jump, their transitions, and then off the springboard on a vault or, on, just the floor for a floor event. So I don't know how much in depth you want me to go there, Dave, as far as like the actual positions and posture. So you kind of tell me. And
well, I think one thing is to clarify too, is to frame up the concept of max acceleration versus top velocity. I think sometimes that's kind of lost on gymnastics coaches. And so I'll just paint the reference in terms of like what you would see on a vault runway. Cause like, it's an important distinction we're trying to make here for vault. You might have 10 to 20 feet that are kind of slow acceleration, and then you're trying to hit your max effort speed in the middle of the runway, and then you hurdle, right? So you're trying to just save as much of that energy as possible. So when you think about, okay, what is max acceleration versus top end speed, we're trying to increase the qualities of how fast can you get accelerated, right? And then what's the max amount of speed you can express before you hurdle on vault, right? And on floor, it's harder because it's 3 steps, it's 3 to 5 steps, right? So you have to have like very quickly, you have to be able to tap into your like acceleration, and then not for all passes, but definitely for the hardest like back tumbling passes, which are like the big high flying, you want to try to hit max speed for the hurdle into the round off to express that force that way. So did I say that right in terms of like speeding up and max acceleration? Or
Yeah.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds great. And so let's talk briefly about what positions or postures do you want to see in that max acceleration phase, right? And then what positions or postures do you want to see in the max speed phase? Because I think, unfortunately, what happens now is literally people just think like, run down the runway and then I'll coach what happens on the board, right? Or like run down the floor and I'll coach what happens in your technical gymnastic skills. But they miss that there's really an ideal way to accelerate and a really ideal way to run in a way that maximizes how much speed you can use on the board or use in a tumbling pass.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with acceleration. So you got to keep in mind that for any event, whether it's gymnastics or track and field or whatever it is, we're starting completely in a standstill, right? That means that we have no body movement and we're trying to project our body forward, right? So essentially what we do is we try to mimic a body posture that sends us in the direction that we want to go, right? So an acceleration posture, so if you kind of look at my hand here, for the audio listeners, sorry.
45 degrees.
But yeah, so essentially, I want to set up my body in a position that's facing the direction that I want to go. So what that means is starting all the way at the bottom with my ankles and knees and my shin position is I want to direct my force going forward in like a 45 degrees position, right? And then I want my body essentially to match up with that. So in acceleration posture, right, one of the big things we talk about from like an extension posture where we strike our foot into the ground is we want to see an angled position from our body that looks like a straight line going from ankle, knee, hip, shoulder, and head, right? So if you can imagine, for my visual people, we have a straight line. This is my head, my elbow is my feet, right? I want that posture looking diagonal and going in the direction that I want to go, right? So,
and for the audio listeners, it's like a 45-degree angle that you're making.
Exactly. So we want to see a forward lean with our entire body as we're accelerating. So every step that we're counting is acceleration as we're trying to pick up speed, is we ideally want to see an athlete that is tipped forward, right? And then what happens is as we transition into top end speed, once we've picked up enough speed that we need, is our body starts trying to just cruise and maintain that speed that we've hit so that we can make an efficient transition. So I like to think of acceleration as aggression, power, and just go. And I think of my top end speed, once we've hit that top end, is just trying to be nice and fluid, like really athletic, and just like maintaining good posture. So it actually starts going kind of diagonal, and we slowly start getting a little bit more and more upright with our entire posture until we hit top speed, and then we just kind of maintain this as we're running.
Yep.
Right. So we're getting more and more upright as we leave acceleration phase and as we approach top end speed phase.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. No, that hits the nail on the head. And I think that's important for someone to think about visually, is if you're looking at someone, say, from the side profile angle when they run on vault, those first maybe 10 to 20 feet, you want to see a lean. You want to see a really explosive arm drive to try to get that initial off the gun, first 20 feet of steps or so, because that is going to allow you to get to your maximal end of speed. And if you have athletes that are standing completely upright and they're just literally running from upright positions when they start, it's going to be really hard for them to reach a max velocity that's helpful when they get down to the board. So you should encourage a little that lean, that forward position, that really good aggressive start with that chest drive forward. You don't want to see someone who literally is upright, salutes, and just like runs upright when they start to go. Like, it's not going to go pretty well. But the other two things I'd like to maybe just make sure people can clarify is, let's just talk a little bit about arm position when they accelerate, and then let's also maybe talk about why we want to get gymnasts away from pointing their toes and having toes plantar flexed when they run. So let's talk about arm position first. It's less controversial, and then foot position.
Yeah. So arms, I think obviously in gymnastics, for a lot of other events, arms are typically by the side. They're not used a whole lot, but when we're trying to pick up max speed, right, our body likes to work in opposition between arm and leg. So if we're driving really hard, especially in acceleration, and this matters a ton in top end speed too, but if we're driving with max aggression with our lower body, right, think your lower body as a push, right? Or we're pushing down and away into the ground with our legs. We got to be able to pull our body forward with our arms. So as far as arm action goes, we need to see really high aggressive arms. And I like to coach kind of like the 90-90. So on the front side, I want to see fingertips up by like the eyebrows at least, with elbow kind of bent at 90. And then on that back side, this is a little bit more like athlete and mobility dependent, is we want that really big, long arm swing on the backside. Ideally also 90, but a lot of athletes do pretty well with like a straight arm, just extended way far back behind them.
Yep.
But I definitely do want to see the hands way past the plane of the body back behind their butt.
Yep.
And then on that front side, I want to see fingertips like up high about like eyebrow, forehead height, with a nice 90-degree posture with the arms.
Yeah, that's great, right? So kind of from the side visual again, you're looking, and I think Tiff Parker, when she came and did a sprinting, she's one of our friends who's an Olympic sprinter. She says like cheek to cheek, right? So like you don't maybe don't want to say that with a kid, but like when your arm is up in front, you want to be eyebrow kind of cheek level, and when you run behind you, you'd like to see your hand getting back towards your butt cheek, right? That separation is what allows the legs to kind of do their thing, and I think the positions of 90-90 to swing harder are important, but also we want reciprocal matching between what the legs are doing, what the arms are doing. And I think that a lot of the mistakes we see, and not just gymnasts, but everybody else, is we see the legs trying to move really, really fast and the arms are like not expressing the same amount of speed. So you have a mismatch between how fast the legs are going and the arms are going. And there's a rate limiter there of if your arms aren't matching your leg speed, you kind of feel like you're running in two directions at once. But also we see a lot of people who are elbow swinging really wide. We have one straight arm, one bent arm, right? So there's like that crossing midline. So you want to clean somebody up as best as you can and get their arms and legs to be straight ahead. It doesn't always, go work perfectly, but you're trying to go forward, not sideways. So when you run with your arms going side to side, you're throwing off your side to side displacement. So I would say just kind of focus on, are you seeing those 90-90 positions like in a frame of reference, but then also is it straight ahead, right? And is it matching the legs? I think those are probably the takeaway simple points for someone who's trying to get the bare bones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, from like, if I had to give you guys like an idea of what I usually coach in a sprint in the gym, I feel like 8 out of 10 times I'm coaching the arms.
Yeah.
And that usually cleans up everything else.
Yeah.
Like the legs, like I think us as humans pretty well know how to run. I think just like biologically, I think we've had that ingrained in us. And I think the only thing that might have gotten in the way is maybe we had like a spear or like
a shield.
Yeah. So that might have thrown off our arm action and running at some point in history. So I think that's maybe what we got to coach out of it.
Yeah.
But
better shield placement. That's what we'll take away.
Yeah. All joking aside, I think I coach arm action more often than I coach anything with the lower half. It tends to clean up a lot of other little details that we're missing on.
That's good too, and I think just from the user error too, in terms of practically for like a lot of younger kids, the arms are easier to think about than the legs. It's hard for some kids to think about like shin angles and knee drive and stuff.
God,
but they see their arms in front of them and they can be like, oh, I'll put these in front of me and swing them harder. Like that makes sense. So okay, that makes good. So let's talk about this one because it's a very controversial point in gymnastics. Is that toe point is religiously taught in all skills. So kids run and hurdle with a large toe point. And why is that maybe not ideal in terms of the max power, mass force kind of thing?
Yeah, this is funny because this is actually one of the things that I've been working on with Ian for the last like month and a half, 2 months or so. And like as soon as like I said it and he noticed it and I like showed it to him on video, he was like, oh crap. Right. And it's that notorious gymnastics toe point when it comes to running, sprinting, bounding, it does get in the way because what we need at impact is we need stiffness of the ankle joint. So what happens is if you have this aggressive toe point down, when you impact the ground, there's a lot more motion that has to go from this toe point back to neutral and then to be able to push off again, right? So we're basically wasting energy and we're wasting elastic energy by not creating stiffness by pointing the toes down towards the ground. So in an ideal situation on foot strike when we run and bound, is we actually want to see that toe slightly curled up. And when I say slightly, right, this is neutral. I want like the slightest bit, right? And like you said, you brought up Tiff Parker earlier. One of the cues that she gave us when she came and did a sprinting seminar for us was pretend like you're holding a little teacup with your foot, right? Just like a little, lift. So your ankle is just slightly what we call dorsiflex. That's the ideal position that we want to maintain as we're kind of going through a swing phase, and then as we're coming down into impact.
Yeah.
In our
don't spill your teacups.
Yeah.
And if some, again, for the audio listeners, we were talking about, like, if you think about a 90-degree toe point for a gymnast, if we think about directly flat of, like, 0 degrees of dorsiflexion and then slightly past that, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? So it's just past that kind of neutral position of the ankle. And I think it's the one thing you mentioned of the ankle, the stiffness is very, very important, but there's two other things too that I think pop into my mind. One is that you have more surface area to hit the floor and express force from. And we know from a muscular recruitment point of view, when you're on your very high toe, you're getting a lot of calf, a lot of quad, right? You're getting a lot of, like, anterior chain dominance, right? When you're on your heel and you can press through your entire foot, you get hamstring and glute recruitment, which is, a massive, massive important indicator of getting somebody to accelerate fast. So you could be training hamstrings, training glutes, training all these other great, musculature, but if you're running on your toes only, you're not tapping into the full force expression profile of your leg, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we hammer, like, I feel like with most sports we hammer like midfoot, midfoot, midfoot.
Yeah.
Like, we're trying to gain ground with, like, the middle of our foot when we strike. Like, ideally, like, we don't, when we're sprinting, we don't heel strike either. Right. But we don't want to toe strike either. So it's like this ideal position where we kind of get, like, I like to say, like, the first, like, third of your foot or so is, like, what we ideally want to strike with, and we want to strike with that entire third of your foot, right? Not just, like, your big toe and then get jammed up.
Yep. Yeah, super well said. And I think, again, this is another very great example of gymnastics specific versus general, right? So generally, we would like to see the athlete being able to run with this good toe position, this good arm position, but when we do a bound, right, like a gymnastics bouncing plyometric or stiffness drill, we would want max toe point, arms by the ears, super stiff, super rigid in a straight line. And this is the thing about why it's so important to teach gymnasts specifically the sport-specific gymnastics techniques, but then also the general techniques, is because they need to learn and understand both and be able to use them in the right context, right? You should be able to sprint like a perfect general athlete to get max speed, but then instantly turn into a gymnast when you hit the board and be very stiff and very rigid in the same way that you should be able to maybe just do like a 1.5 punch layout. You should be able to do a good sprinting run generally, turn into an athlete for the round off and the bounding of connecting your skills, and then land properly with proper deceleration in a way that's not going to hurt your ACL, right? There's the ability to learn and integrate both. Those are the athletes that kind of come out the other side most successful.
Boom. Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think, and this is literally in every single sport, is I always say, like, human first, general athlete second, and then the sports specific athlete third.
Yep.
Right. So you got to make sure you're knocking out human and general athlete first, being able to distinguish all that. And then when it comes to, like, your actual technical aspect of your sport, display that after you've mastered general athleticism.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I think we nailed positions very, very well. So let's talk about maybe the middle aspect of power and plyometrics that you had now, the second P.
Yeah. Actually, let's backtrack a little bit, because I think we talked acceleration, but I think we missed top end speed
you are
a little bit.
You are totally right. We missed the middle.
I think I, like, quickly mentioned it. So as I was saying with acceleration, we want this, like, long angled torso, shoving us in the direction that we want to go with a very positive shin angle. Once we've kind of hit that top speed, and I don't know that you're going to see a lot of this on floor. Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know definitely in vault you're going to, definitely more vault, I think, but you're definitely going to have this phase where you have, like, and, looking at videos from my athletes, it's probably like between 6 to 8 steps of, like, just top upright sprinting.
Yep.
Is that top end speed, we actually want to be very upright, where our head, shoulders, and hips are stacked completely vertical with nothing moving forward and back, right? I think one of the bigger things that we see in, like, younger untrained athletes is, like, a head that keeps getting shoved forward. I call it chicken necking, right? Athletes that'll, like, continuously pull with their chest and their neck and do all this, like, crazy twisting and turning. But in top end speed, we want to have really nice upright posture where head, shoulders, and hips are really steady, right? And that rib cage is turning a little bit, right? And then the legs are striking up and down, but nothing else is really moving. So an ideal position here is we want really, really good knee drive on that front side. So we want a knee that gets up to about hip height. And then at foot strike down on the ground, it's no longer back and away, just like acceleration was. It's a little bit more foot underneath the hip at contact, at foot contact. And then when you cycle through, we want what we call a high heel recovery, where you're kind of swinging your heel close to your butt, so you can kind of cycle your knee back out in front of you and then get it to hip height again.
Yep. Yeah.
So it's going to be a lot more cyclical, whereas acceleration is a lot more like aggressive punch back and away.
Yep.
Right. So top end speed cyclical, acceleration punch back and away.
Yeah, no, super well said. I'm glad you interrupted me and made sure we covered that. That's very important. Yeah, there's two things that popped in my mind. One is the other error I see a lot in gymnasts, especially, is they get their torso upright by arching their back a lot, right? They don't get upright with a good, stiff, solid anterior core. They sit up under their passive stabilizers, right? And they're just like running with their ribs flared. So it's important to teach athletes how to brace their core and push those ribs down so that when they do get extension on their back leg, it's coming from the glute, the hamstring complex with the lower back. It's not just literally running on their lower back extensors, right? That's a big problem. I see a lot of kids who have back pain when they run. And the second piece too is, again, this is another reason why that toe up, not toe point, is so important, because in the recovery phase, when you pull your leg through, if your toe is pointed and you're maybe not really focusing on hip drive, you hit with your foot not that far in front of you and up on that top toe. So you're essentially running backwards, right? You're trying to go forward, but your body's trying to like stop you and break you. And so a lot of kids, especially in the last 2 to 3 steps before they hurdle on vault, will run in a way that looks like they're going to like stop the other way. Like they'll put their foot out too close to their body, or they won't really have really good shin up angle and toes up, so they can't get that round off turnover, or they can't plant that last foot to jump for a forward entry vault. And I think, again, doesn't look like gymnastics specific stuff, but you don't get deducted on your run, so don't worry about the form of your running. Do what's best for your power. You get judged when you hit the board, and that's what's more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like it. Good. So I think we crushed the run, right? We got all that max acceleration, middle. So yeah, let's talk about positions and powers are good. Now let's go on to like actual power and plyometric and kind of the increasing force or velocity side of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the next bucket, and we kind of mentioned this earlier with the power equals force times velocity aspect, right? But now that we know that we get increased force and increased velocity, right? The question is, how do we do that? So one of the first ways that we talk about force is, let's get a good strength program in for the lower body and upper body, so we can just put out a little bit more output, or give the muscle potential to put out more output, right? So that's going to be done by your basic big compound movements, squatting, hinging, deadlifting, lunging, things like that, with external weight, ideally, to just produce a little bit more potential for force. The one thing that you got to keep in mind there is going to be a specificity aspect of it, right? And we've kind of talked about like from even like a sprinting standpoint of general to then specific for gymnastics. Same thing applies to training in the gym. So when I say general, I'm talking about like bilateral strength with 2 feet underneath you, right? But that's not how running and sprinting happens. Sprinting is in a split pelvis position. So our general force production strength training looks like squatting, deadlifting.
Yep.
Our specific strength training is going to look like lunging, single leg RDL type stuff, right? So it's a little bit more specific to that split pelvis position, where we're learning to create power. We're learning to create a little bit of hip separation, where we're extending one side and flexing the other side.
Yeah. No, super well said. And I think before we talk about like velocity stuff, so because I know a lot of coaches now are like, I get it, I want to try it, but they don't know where to start. So in your mind, if you had to give somebody kind of like a very general approach to maybe 2 exercises and then set rep ranges and the frequency of doing those things with external weightlifting, like what would that look like for the everyday coach?
Yeah. So for me, if we're talking about a younger athlete, I'm always going to start them with like a kettlebell, right? Kettlebell or a dumbbell. So I'm going to give them a kettlebell to hold at their chest and do some squatting for my general strength training, right? That might look like in the forms of 3 sets of 8 to start, and then maybe as they kind of progress, I want to kind of take volume down. That might be 3 sets of 5, maybe 4 sets of 5. Let them get a little bit stronger. The other exercise that I would pick would be a deadlift, right? Where now we're not so much going up and down with our hips and bending ankles, knees, and hips maximally. It's going to be a little bit more of a posterior weight shift backwards with our hips. So we're loading mostly the hip structure, not so much the quad. And we'd go, kettlebell on our hands. We're reaching our butt back, maintaining a nice flat back, whole foot on the ground. So we're training the posterior chain, the hamstrings, and the hips. Similar, that might look like 3 sets of 8 to begin with, and then as we want to kind of taper down on volume, increase the loading a little bit, that might be 3 sets of 5, 4 sets of 5, something like that.
Yep, exactly.
Right, and then for my specific, that might be lunging. For my beginners, I'm probably going to go regular split squat, where again I have like a load out in front of me. They're in a split pelvis position, one foot in front of the other, and they're just loading up most of their weight, like 80% on their front leg, and they're just going up and down in a static split, like a static lunge position. and they're doing that. An advanced athlete might go weights by their side. They're stepping back into a lunge and then propelling themselves back forward. Or someone more advanced might go into like a forward lunge where they're kind of learning to put the brakes now. Forward lunge, push back. It's probably also going to be similar, 3 sets of 8, 3 sets of 10 each side, and then maybe progress to 3 sets of 6, something like that.
Yep. Perfect. Awesome. And so let's say last little button up here is if you were out of season in a general strength block, how many days per week do you think it'd be good to try to do some of these weightlifting things versus if you were in season, would you do it? And if you did, how many times?
Yeah. So for frequency throughout the week in an off season block, 2 to 3 times a week is probably good.
Yep.
I know gymnasts have a hard time staying completely away from the gymnastic stuff.
Yeah.
So even the off season, they're probably beating themselves up quite a bit. So I try to not have my gymnasts in more than 3 times a week. I would say even 2 is good enough. In season, really 1. Like if I have an athlete that's adamant about coming in more than once a week, that second day is probably going to be super like low key, a little bit more focused towards recovery and really just filling in some empty buckets that they're lacking. For in season, I know how high the stresses are in practice and in competition. So I really just want to see an athlete like once a week working on some of these things.
Perfect. Yeah, and I agree. I think lucky to work with a lot of collegiate teams, and we know a lot of the strength coaches at top Division I gymnastics schools, and I think they're really on board with this too, along with many people around the world, like Nick and some other people who are consulting with some of the elite national teams. Off season is like 2 for most people. I would only go 3 if it was a very, very top end athlete, right? They're training 2-a-days, they're doing like very elite level skills, but I think most gymnasts can get away very well with 2 days of more of the general kind of weightlifting stuff, and then doing 2 days of really hard gymnastics specific strengthening, and then 1 day of maybe like a mix of like gymnastics basics and flexibility and strength. So I think 5 days for most gymnasts is really how to get to a great goal profile. So I think I would view that in the off season as maybe like, for the first block, it's 50-50 between general and gymnastics specific. And then as maybe the season goes on, it shifts to like that 75% gymnastics and, 25% in the weight room stuff. And then in season, it's kind of like, 20-80 with 1 day per week. If you're training like 5 sessions per week in the gym and you put another 1 on top of that, it's not going to crush you, right? And so I think it's all about understanding the time and the context to do this kind of stuff. But I just wanted to kind of make sure we explained everybody's kind of like thoughts that are probably coming up after the fact of what do I do with this information. But so I think that's the strength side of the power development. So do you want to talk a little bit about like the velocity end of that? Like how would you say someone's getting a little stronger, say someone does feel some strength gains and they're ready to start working on more explosive power for either sprinting or stuff like that. Now what are we talking about?
Yeah, so that's again, I look at it in general and then specific, right? So general for me is going to be a little bit more like vertical power through, let's say, like seated vertical jumps, box jump type variations. You mentioned a depth jump earlier. Even that can be kind of manipulated to be a little bit more on the force end of things versus velocity end of things. So we actually differentiate between a depth jump and a drop jump. A drop jump would be a little bit more like as soon as you hit the ground, you pop off for a little bit more velocity, versus a depth would be like a higher box that you're jumping off of, recoiling a little bit more than jumping up. But I always just look at it in like the full like spectrum of force versus velocity, right? It's not so much like a black and white, like this is force, this is velocity. Is we can always kind of teeter back and forth on what's a little bit more force. So if I'm talking about getting a little bit more on the velocity end of things, but it still might work on some force producing capabilities, that might be like a resisted broad jump, right? I put a band around someone's hips, I have them jump forward, I'm producing horizontal displacement force now, but it's got a resisted band on them. So that might actually be a little bit more on like the force end of things when it comes to a jumping variation, right? Now we take that the other way, and let's say we're going now repeated broad jumps, we're connecting broad jumps all in a row, where it's really quickly rebounding off the ground. Now we're working on horizontal displacement force, and we're working velocity because we're quickly connecting the jumps all in a row, right? So see how we're kind of getting more towards like that cyclical motion of sprinting, and that's essentially what it is, right? So if we want to work on velocity for sprinting, we start prescribing things that are a little bit more in the same plane that we're working sprinting in, and then something similar velocity, or at least trying to approach that velocity.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. And kind of with that, on the next progression of what we did before is like, I think one of the mistakes I definitely made as a younger coach, and I think a lot of other coaches are making, is they think we need more power, let's throw a ton of sets and reps and volume, and they're doing like 300, 400 ground contacts on plyometrics, not thinking about like this is a explosive movement, and we need to understand the physiology behind those type 2 fibers, but also how they work on that energy system. Is like, you can't just throw a whole bunch of plyos or jumping things in a circuit and expect some kid to have the energy to reproduce that force over and over in each set, because you're just making a long aerobic type workout and you're exhausting that energy system. So it's really more about maximal intent, maximal effort, and then giving them enough rest and recovery between these things to actually produce that force again. So again, what are maybe the sets, the rep ranges, the frequency that you're thinking about these things now versus maybe a strength side?
Yeah, so when it comes to prescribing any like jumping, bounding type stuff, I try to keep it, and I'm going to give it in sets and reps again, but usually my jumps are like 3 sets of 4.
Yep.
Right, maybe 5. And that's done on purpose. So Dave kind of mentioned energy systems. So if we're working on power, right, the energy systems that we're talking about is called the creatine phosphate system, which really is like your max effort, like it's go time type, like energy substrates that last maybe up to 10 seconds.
Yep.
Right. So if we're doing 8, 10, 12 jumps, we're going to definitely exceed that time frame where we're actually going to be utilizing that energy system without leaking into our other energy system that's a little bit more based towards conditioning and a little bit less on power. All right, so that's going to be like one aspect of it. 2 is if we want to do max effort variations of jumping, we also got to keep in mind that there's going to be maximal force involved. So the landing and the deceleration, that's going to slowly start beating up on your joints. So like there's only so much contact that we can handle where we're having to really slow down our body weight that's coming at a high velocity, high force without stressing structures like ankles, knees, hips.
Yep.
Right. So we're doing it for one to develop the right system, but we're also doing it in a way so that we're not over fatiguing athletes, increasing potential chance of injury.
Yeah. Yeah, again, and I think the light bulb that goes off in my mind is thinking about the way we're prescribing and training these things, right? Like I think an error I made and many coaches make is like, okay, we need to work on getting faster for sprinting, so we're going to do a sprint workout, and they don't realize that the work to rest ratios and how they design that program is not allowing that athlete to tap into their max effort every single time. So we know from some physiology research that this PCR and even like that lower end of anaerobic, when you're starting to talk about repeated, it's like you need like a 1 to 5 to 10 to work with rest ratio. So that means if you do a max effort sprint for 5 seconds down the runway, and then you have their partner go for 5 seconds, then they turn around and go again 20 seconds later, you have not given them time to replenish that energy system. And so when they're not going faster and they're still slow and you're yelling at them, go faster, you're being lazy, is this a program design error or is this an effort error, right? Like we have to be able to put ourselves on the hot plate here and be like, okay, well, we know, okay, if we really want max effort speed, you're trying to train absolute top end speed, you should have a 1 to 10 work to rest ratio minimum, right? So like that means a 7-second sprint down your vault runway, and you need probably at least 2 minutes or 3 minutes before they're going to do another max effort sprint, right? So like maybe you get in 5 top end speed sprints in like 15 to 20 minutes, right? But those will be very high quality max effort, expression profiles versus like 20 sprints in a cardio quote unquote workout, big air quotes there, in a cardio workout where you have the kids are doing like, relay races or relay sprints, and they have 2 partners and they're going on a 1 to 3 work to rest ratio, right? That's an energy systems repeat sprintability situation. That is not working top end speed. So if your kids aren't getting faster and you're not either using external weightlifting or programming correctly or giving them proper time domains to work on sprinting, whose fault is that? That's not the kid's effort. That's our program design error.
Yeah, that's for sure on the coaches. Yeah, and this might like freak some people out, but like the general rule of thumb for recovery to work for sprinting is for every 10 yards that you're running, you need a minute of break, right?
Wow.
That's like not that 10 yards is short. 10 yards is very short.
Yeah. So 70, you think, 6 to 7 yards, in a vault sprint for max effort, that's like 6 minutes.
Yeah, if we're talking like a high level athlete that can actually output a ton of energy in a 60-yard sprint or like 30-yard sprint, whatever it is, like they need a lot of break.
Yeah.
to be able to repeat that effort again.
Yeah, and I can kind of give somebody or give people a practical alternative solution. And if you have any, please weigh in. But when I'm trying to do these things, especially like, explosive box jumps, or if I'm doing sprint work, or I'm trying to work on that top velo or that top expression profile, what I usually do is program in triplets or more in circuits to try to make sure they have some other stuff. So they might do, a set of 4 seated dumbbell jumps and then go over and do some sort of like core warm up exercise or some sort of upper body like handstand development, something, or another like accessory piece where we can still be productive. And it's not like you're standing around waiting 5 minutes for your next sprint turn, but you can do like sprint or a jump and then go do 3 other things. And obviously it's not ideal with complete recovery for the system, but you're doing an active recovery, I guess. And by the time you get back to your sprint, you might not be at 100%, but you're maybe around like 80 or 90 and you can work on that kind of stuff. So there's a way to program these things where you can still work that explosive power and top end speed or top end, jumping, and then come back around maybe every 4 minutes on a cycle. And you can have like one set of group that does, okay, jumping, and then 3 other exercises. There's another half of the group that does their sprint work over on the runway, and then 3 other exercises in 4 sets. And you can get a really good 30-minute workout where those kids are all getting the qualities they need, but it's not like they're standing around doing nothing.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think, and what I'm about to say might like bring on another topic that we might have to spend another day talking about. But if you're generally conditioned pretty well, as long as you're not reusing that creatine phosphate system, so that the 1 to 10 second burst of power, doing another movement that doesn't tap into that again, as like your rest, your active rest, like Dave called it, you can replenish that pretty heavily. I would say, I think I've seen research that shows even greater than 90% full recovery. But you do have to be generally well conditioned, meaning have a pretty good aerobic base. So that's the other topic that I don't want to get into too much today. But if you're generally a well conditioned athlete, you should be able to, in your active rest, like Dave said, doing some core drills, doing some like technical like skill work that doesn't require a lot of energy and power. You should be able to replenish that. So we're not saying like, hey, have your athletes sprint and then rest 7 minutes on their phone or anything like that. There's like ways to program it so they get a lot out of your training session.
Yeah, you absolutely just signed yourself up for a part 2 podcast where we talk about why gymnasts need an aerobic base and why running outside on concrete for a half hour is not the way to get it. So we'll balance this like good cop, bad cop, and then the part 2 of this will be like why gymnasts should do some long aerobic conditioning. But I digress. Let's keep people in a good light for your first podcast. All right, so yeah, we got. Is there anything else to cover on the? I think we have. Right, strength development, we understand how to get the kids stronger, what set, what rep, what frequency, in season, out season, and then velocity side of what, set profile, stuff like that. And you mentioned some good exercises. So seated dumbbell jumps, you mentioned resisted broad jumps are really, really good. You mentioned also, there was one more that I'm forgetting, some depth jumps.
Like a continuous broad jump. Yeah.
Yep, also a really good one. And then I think the last little piece of that too is kind of on the technical side, I guess now is practice. Let's talk a little bit about like not only like the need to practice these skills, but then also like what are some of the actual sprinting mechanic drills that you like to try to reinforce some of these good patterns?
Yeah, so when it comes to practice, obviously we got to keep in mind like stresses and demands of all the other stuff that a gymnast has to go through for practice and to be ready for competition, right? So we can't treat them like a track athlete where we can just hammer a bunch of sprints in an hour. We don't have that amount of time.
Yep. So
you got to really learn to maximize. So when I say practice, we're bringing in drills that's going to help them increase their positions, right? That we talked about before. And then we're obviously working on power separately, or we can even combine like a power drill, and then we can go ahead and do some of our like wall drills that we really like for acceleration, where you have an athlete lean up against the wall with their hands. And all they do is have one knee up at their hip height, the other back leg extended back behind them. And we teach them what good hip separation looks like with one side extended, one side flexed, and a forward torso lean, right? And then we can also start doing like some switches, like 1-2 switches or a single switch, where they drive that up knee down and then cycle. So that's like an easy practice drill that we can throw in. Other things that I love are skips of different varieties, A skips, B skips. If you guys don't know what these are, you can literally go on YouTube and you can probably find a bunch of different, videos for that. But, A skips, B skips, A runs, B runs, and then some like basic bounding stuff, right? Some forward bounding. We're talking like track and field bounding, again, not like gymnastics toe point bounding. Stuff like that works super well to practice. And then for like the specificity end, to really actually get you better at either acceleration for top end speed is we put you in position, or we put our athletes in positions to actually work on acceleration separately and then work on top end speed separately, so that we're not overdoing the stress of it, right? So what an acceleration session might look like is we might put them in, we actually really like a half kneel or like a push-up start that actually gives them a little bit of context for an athlete to start kind of forward and leaned over. Because we might ask an athlete to start in one knee on the ground, lean their shins forward, lean their torso forward, have their arms ready to go in that 90-90 position, cheek to cheek, like Dave mentioned, and then just drive hard and forward away from that position and just do like a 10-yard sprint, right? So nothing more. We're not overdoing it. So we might do like 4 to 5, 6 total accelerations from a kneeling start, and that's going to be our practice for acceleration, right? But again, these have to be max effort.
Yep.
So we're not saying you got to go out there and do like 70 feet of sprinting every single day, right? Let's break it up so we work on acceleration, right? And then what we can do is we can have another session in the week work on top end speed. So this one, we do it a lot with a wood weight curve treadmill that we have at our gym, but obviously not everyone's going to have access to this. But if you want to work on top end speed for an athlete and you just want to do it on like the vault track, what you can do is what's called a flying start. Right, so essentially you're starting with like a 5-yard fly, we call it. That's just essentially 5 yards, building up a little bit of momentum. And then you have like a 10-yard, 15-yard runway where you just go max effort and you're just looking for that really upright vertical posture. And they're just going as hard as they can, again, just for the 10 to 15 yards.
Yep.
And now we're just working on top end speed for just that little burst of time or that little amount of distance.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And we do the same kind of drill with the vault runway. We just do like, again, 10, we put a cone at the very start, a cone 10 feet, and then a cone 30 feet, and then another cone 10 feet past that. And that's what you get, right? You get like, here's your acceleration to kind of get into your top speed. From the middle cone to the next cone of that 30 feet, you got to like gas it hard. And then you have that kind of braking runway at the last, 5 or 10 feet, whatever, to slow down. And then that allows the athletes to kind of just work on that middle section of like really explosive. You should be getting after it pretty hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's perfect. Like flying starts are awesome for working on top end speed.
Yep. Yeah, man. So I think we crushed that. I think we crushed like all the actual sprinting stuff. And I think there's a lot of like things to digest and think about right there. But I'd like to maybe just kind of, because what we've explained in the sprinting domain of how we develop power, which is why we started there, the concepts of how you develop somebody to run faster and sprint faster is the same thing of how you develop somebody to jump higher and to be able to land safely. So I'd like to maybe just wrap things up by talking a little bit about how these things apply to the jumping and landing side of things, which is, running is horizontal force displacement and jumping and landing is vertical force displacement. And both are super, super important for, our gymnasts in particular to understand and train. But can we maybe switch the conversation that way? And then I'll finish up by talking again about like bounding, jumping and landing versus versus general bounding and landing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this conversation is not that different, right? When it comes to landing a jump or producing power in a jump, it again comes down to force velocity, right? If we're talking about demonstrating jump height, we're talking about displaying force times velocity. When we're talking about coming back down, we're talking about absorbing force times velocity. So the way we prep our athletes, really good strength training to get them strong enough to produce the power, but to also be able to handle coming back down and absorb that power. And then 2 is going to be just practice and teaching them good, again, postures, positions. Okay, so it's not that different the conversation. So when we talk about jumping and landing, we first teach an athlete how to land by stacking ankles, knees, and hips all in really good alignment and good like torso position without their back completely like bent forward and rounded or like overly arched. So we teach just really good mechanics for landing. And then as far as jumping goes, I think that one's pretty simple. Just jump really high. Hopefully we've made you strong enough and you can display that. But then, just land safely back down on the ground. So I think that conversation is, again, not that different. Obviously, when it gets into like the actual gymnastics end of going from your like top velocity sprint to then springing into the ground, and Dave can talk way more about this, but that transition into a vault is going to be a little bit different technically from a gymnastics standpoint.
Right.
But from a strength conditioning piece, it's strong enough to produce force and strong enough to absorb force and technically sound enough to land safely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I can wrap it up pretty well. Like you said, it's like, so let's just think conceptually, right? There's we've been talking about this, but I really want to drop this point home. There's the general jumping and landing. There's the general ability to squat jump really high and land properly that you need, right? And that would be more applicable when someone is doing like landing a double back or landing a dismount off bars or something of that nature. Like the proper squat pattern of knees hip width apart, force absorption on the hamstrings, the glutes, like the way you should technically properly land. Unfortunately, not the way that a lot of gymnasts are taught to land, right? Which is a whole different podcast for its own, right? But there's the general side, which is like, okay, if we want to generally be able to land bigger vaults and not be destroyed by the landing forces themselves, again, it's strength and velocity. We have to be able to increase the strength, goblet squats, deadlifting, split squats, step ups, right? But also like understanding the eccentric component of that is it's probably more important in terms of like landing properly. So, riding some, eccentric tempo pause squats to a box are really great in a goblet squat to understand what that bottom position feels like. But then also, I like something we already mentioned is like seated dumbbell jumps are a great option here because obviously you can explode off the ground, but you have to land if you have like 10-pound dumbbells in your hands. You're learning how to land with proper load on top of you in a very quick twitch kind of point of view. So you can develop someone's strength profile generally. And then also it's technique, right? It's like if you know how to land properly with your knees hip width apart, your hips driving back, and you're using the right musculature based on what we know from science, well, you're going to be more able to handle that force and you'll probably stick more landings. You'll probably land and not take as many steps versus if you don't use proper technical landing patterns, right, and you don't land well, you're going to have a much harder time. It's very hard to land when all the pressure is going through your knee and your ankle joints and your lower back, right? You walk all over the place, you're bouncing out of bounds, all that kind of stuff. So there's like that half of it, which is like you can train specifically for strength and force absorption. Then on the velocity side is what we already talked about, which is using velocity-based jumping and sprinting and stuff like that. But then also that's where technique also comes into play in terms of like energy leakage, right? And this is going to start to transition to the bounding side. But the better technically sound you are, if you understand how to really engage your core and create tension and prepare and watch for your landing, you can be kind of pre-tensioned, right? You can kind of turn on some of that musculature ahead of landing time and be more snappy in terms of when you can turn on the right musculature or when you can grade your force. So like that's one bucket on one side, which is general. And then the gymnastics specific stuff is the exact same conversation, but then in different contexts is like if you want to be stronger to bound properly on the floor or bound properly on the actual springboard, you need to train high-level core strength. You need to train high-level bracing strategies. You need to understand that there's no amount of technical plyomat jumps you can do if your kids just have legs that aren't strong enough. Eventually the force is going to win. It's going to buckle you against the springboard. So you have to work everything we know is important in gymnastics in terms of squatting and jumping and all these things that we've talked about. But then on the velocity side, again, train proper plyometrics in the right volume and context, and then make sure you understand that the stiffer you are, the less energy you leak on the equipment, right? So if you're understanding and teaching kids how to brace their entire body really, really tight, which is just laying on your ground, right, laying on the ground and squeezing your body as tight as you can, and then you say, okay, now bounce on the springboard really, really tight, and bounce on the floor really, really tight, and you work on the skill of stiffness, then it turns into tumbling drills, then it turns into vaulting drills. It's like it's the exact same conversation in two different categories. You just need to know and teach each one. Know and teach the general side, know and teach the bouncy stiffness side, and then it becomes, a technical awareness thing of understanding how to do that in skills. So that was a word vomit and a long rant, but I know for sure people started this podcast wanting to know what drills should I do to make my kids more bouncy in front tucks, right? And the unfortunate answer is like, well, there's a lot of things that we have to talk about first before I give you my best front tuck drills or my best vaulting drills or the best sprinting drills. You can't just look on Instagram and be like, ooh, that looks fun, and then like put all these ridiculous drills in when your kids aren't strong enough or your kids aren't understanding technically how to do these things well. If you don't know where to start, how do you know where you're going?
Yeah.
There we go. I think that was good. I think we've covered successfully everything we wanted to get out of this podcast, right? Is there anything else on your mind that, errors that are commonly made or other topics that we haven't really dived into or anything else on?
No, I think we did cover quite a bit. And obviously, like, I'm not like super aware of gymnastics. I think I've tried a little bit harder to learn a little bit more of that stuff, but I think culturally there might be some stuff that I'm missing on, but
it's good.
If there's more to talk about, we can come back on and talk about it.
No, trust me. We love and want the outside opinion that isn't from the gymnastics world, because trust me, we have enough of that already in terms of like a billion different ideas for how to train the same stuff. But my summary of the key points is think about again, acceleration speed versus top end speed. Think about those 3 Ps that Dewey said about what you should be looking for positions, and then understanding how do you train power, and then how do you practice these things. And then for jumping and landing is try to make sure you're taking the same context of the sprinting conversation, just in an up and down instead of a front to back point of view. So most of these things, again, if you're hearing this podcast in the next 2 months, are not things you're going to want to implement right away, but you should be brainstorming for the next upcoming off season of like, okay, what's that first 6-week block going to look like? And then what is the next 6-week block going to look like? And then can I find a strength coach to work with? Is there a local, gym that I can bring the athletes to for weightlifting? Can I consult with someone to Skype in and teach me about these proper movement patterns? How do you coach a deadlift? How do you do these sprint drills? So start getting the gears turning. If you want to get your kids stronger and faster for next season, you have to start tomorrow to plan for the summer or the off season if you're an international viewer.
Yes.
Sounds good, man.
Plan, prepare, dominate.
Oh, I like it. What a stamp of approval. I think we crushed it, man. I think we got a lot. I thank you so much for not only this time, but all the other effort you've put into the gymnastics world when we have people at Champions. So where can people find you? Because I'm sure that we have a lecture online if people want to check it out. But where can people find more about this kind of stuff and maybe just start wrapping their head around this side of the fence?
Yeah, I'm not like super active on social quite yet.
Okay.
A lot of like in-person gym to take care of.
That's because you're actually working. Shocker.
Yeah, I might work full time, maybe a little more. But if you guys have like literally any questions, like feel free to reach out to me. I am like active-ish on Instagram. I don't post a whole lot, but if you guys want to like DM me, my handle is Diwesh, Diwesh Poudyal on Instagram. And then you guys can shoot me an email if you guys have any questions, or if you guys want to talk about anything. Just shoot me an email at, again, first name, last name at champ.pt.
Perfect. Got it. Right. And we'll let this one fly out in a couple weeks. Then I'm sure we'll be booking a time to have that other lengthy discussion about why gymnasts should actually do some aerobic and long distance training. So we'll get there.
All right. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Yep.
It was a blast.
I'll see you in like an hour at work.
Yeah.
Later.
See ya.